The first thing you want to do is make sure you have a good photo for the project. The choices you make when taking this photo will either make your life easier or harder when completing the project. You want to choose a good subject. An easier subject would be anything with fur versus anything with smooth skin or surfaces. You also want to make sure you zoom in. By zooming in, I don't mean taking a photo of the entire animal's body and then using your phone to crop closer to the face later on. I mean physically zoom in, with your feet. Take the photo by having the camera really close to the animal's face. If you can't see individual hairs in your photos that you take, then keep retaking photos. These individual hairs are great for observational drawing. They will tell you the length and the direction you need to take when making your marks. If everything is too blurry and you can't see these hairs, or you have overexposure, then you start guessing and it might not look good in the end. Finally, you need to make sure that you have good lighting. I would wait until the evening time, turn all the lights off in the house except for one table lamp. I'd place this light close to the subject and then take the photo. This way, you have really light areas versus really dark areas. The more dark areas you have, the easier the project will be because you don't have to remove very much of the material in these locations. If you have a second light on, let's say over here, you would have less of these dark areas, and that means more work. We will be drawing this image first on a thin white sheet of paper that is the same exact size as your Scratchboard. Then we're going to transfer the image from the white sheet of paper to the Scratchboard later on. So next, we will need to make sure that you print your photo in a size that will work with this drawing paper. Your Scratchboard paper is 10 inches by 14 inches. So your photo will need to be half that size. This means you need to print out a 5 by 7 reference photo. There are two different methods you can use to help you transfer this image onto your drawing paper. You can either measure and plot or use a grid. You can even do a combination of both of these methods. For measuring and plotting, you will first need to determine the best location for your dots. You can place them where things end, or you can place them on the highest and lowest part of curves, or the farthest part of curves. You can also place them on intersections, so where one thing collides into the next, like here. Or this intersection where his neck goes into his face. You don't want to put too many dots. You don't want to go dot, dot, dot all the way around because that's unneeded amount of dots. If this dot wasn't here, it might be a little challenging to get this to be completely accurate because then I would be guessing how high this eye would have to go. So having this dot is beneficial, but I don't need another dot and another dot and another dot because I can guess from here to there, I can guess from here to there. So whenever you're worried about your guess, just put another dot in. I'd put at the top of the pupil and the bottom of the pupil on both sides. I'd put it at the farthest point and the other farthest point of the nose, the bottom of the nose, the top of the nose. If you're worried about guessing on how big to make this nostril, you can put another dot in there on both sides. You can even put one at the top of that nostril. And then you just draw from dot to dot, and then you can be very accurate that way. On these areas, even though this is not a clear line, I would still place a dot just so I know where it's at. I'd place dots on the endings of big chunks of value or the middle of this curve. Where does this light area start to end? Maybe right about there. That would be good to know. Where does this part of the body end? Right here. Where does this chunk of value cross on the side of the paper? Where does the ear cross? Right here and right here on that edge of the paper. So you can go all the way around the edges and mark wherever major value changes are crossing. I would mark this is a major shape right here, so I'd mark the end of that shape. I would also mark the ends of all of these dark shapes. So any larger shapes that you see, even though they're not clearly defined, I would mark those to give me some guidance. Definitely the bottoms of these white shapes, the side and the farthest edge of those white shapes. It's very difficult to tell where to put the dot here, but I see it kind of curves up into a point, so that might be a good spot to put it. The end of this black shape right there. And then again, if you get worried or you're not sure of something, stick another dot in there. I might want to know where some of these hairs are coming from. Maybe I won't do all of the hairs, but I'll do just enough to help me out later on. Maybe I'll do the ends of these whiskers. And if I have a few of these drawn in, then I can just freehand the ones in between. So I'll do that same thing on this side. So maybe I want to know where the top hair is. And then pick one of these middle hairs. So this one goes to right there. Maybe one more. And then I'll freehand this chunk of hairs in between. So that looks like a good amount of dots. The nice thing about using the measuring and plotting technique is I can transfer less and less dots as I feel more and more confident with freehanding. So maybe as I get good at this, maybe I would only have 2 dots on the eye just to give me an idea of size, and then freehand the rest of that eye. Now it's time to measure and plot. Remember, this side of your reference photo is this side of your drawing paper. This side of the reference photo is this side of the drawing paper. So now we have to take all of these distances and double them. So I'm going to start with the eye. I need to take this distance and double it, and this distance and double it. I can use a pencil to measure the distances, or I can cut up some strips of paper and use that. It's more accurate to use the strips of paper than the pencil, but I'll show you both methods. I'm going to begin by measuring and plotting this dot. I put the tip of the paper on the dot. It's not over the dot, it's not short from the dot, it is pointing directly to that dot. And I mark the edge of the paper with my thumb. Then I'm going to reline my thumb up over on this edge of the paper. It's important that you look straight down when you're doing this to gain accuracy, and I go that distance once, that distance twice. On the second mark, I extend it out parallel to what I measured from. So I measured from this vertical edge, and so the dot is becomes a vertical line. You do not connect the dots, and that's where some students get confused. So again, I measured. I went 1, 2, and extended it parallel to what I measured from. Now I need to measure it from another direction. So let's see how far down it is. Tip of the pencil on the dot, mark the edge of the box with my thumb, reline my thumb up on the edge of the box, and I go that distance once, and that distance twice. On my second dot, I extend it parallel, so the same direction as what I measured from, and I extend it until they cross. Once they cross, that's right where that dot would remain. So I can erase all of my excess marks, and that's all the information I need for that dot. And then move on to another dot that's next to that. So let's go ahead and measure and plot the dot at the top. So I'm going to take my measuring stick this time because it's more accurate. I put the tip of the measuring stick, same thing as I did with the pencil, with the tip of the pencil, tip of the measuring stick, pointing to the dot. It's not covering the dot up. And I mark the edge of the box. All I want to do is reline up that mark. It might be high, it might be low, it doesn't matter. All I have to focus on is making sure that this mark is lined up with the edge of the paper. And then I transfer my distance once, I transfer my distance twice, and then I extend that one out parallel to what I measured from, which is this edge of the paper. So all I did was reline this mark up with the edge of the paper and go once, mark it, twice, mark it, and then I extended that line out vertically to match the edge of the paper. So I measured this way. Now I have to measure how far down it is. You always have to measure the two directions. So I mark the edge of the box. I line it back up, and again, some people are like, well, where do you line it up? I just have to line the mark up. It's okay if I'm a bad guesser and I put it way over there versus way over here. It doesn't really matter. Just line the mark up. And I go that distance once, drag it down, reline that up, that distance twice. Extend the second dot out parallel to what I measured from, which is this. And then I have my two marks. Those are my two hints. So now I have to extend that out, extend this out. Wherever it crosses, that's right where my dot is. I don't need that first mark anymore. I don't need any of these extended marks. I just need the dot that was in the middle. And then play connect the dot. So carefully look at the shape and then see how does it wrap around to the other shape. So that doesn't look too accurate. It looks like it goes up and then it bows down. And then go to the next dot. So here I want to know where this darkness separates from the light. So I'm going to take my measuring stick. You can cross off any old marks that you might have. And I am going to measure how far over that dot is. Tip of the paper on the dot. Mark the edge of the box, line it up somewhere in here, but the mark needs to be lined up. That distance once, that distance twice. Remember, you're not connecting the dots. You're extending the second mark out parallel to what you measured from, which is a vertical line. So I measured how far over it was. Now I have to measure how far down it is. Tip of the paper on that same dot, cross off both marks, mark the edge of the box. Reline it up anywhere here, just this mark has to line up with the end of the paper. I go that distance once and that distance twice. On my second dot, I extended it out parallel to the edge I measured from, horizontal and horizontal. Now I have my two extended marks. I extend them even further until they cross. Where they cross, that's right where the dot is for the eye. Erase your first dot, erase your excess. Carefully look at the shape between the two dots and then draw it. So you're going to continue doing this all the way around the eye. You're going to have a second line that you do because typically animals will have this darker outline. So then I would draw a second line going around the eye and then it just will fade back in. Whether you're doing a grid drawing or measuring and plotting, you got to be careful when you're drawing the outlines or the contours next to the black shapes. You never want to just simplify and draw a straight line because when you transfer that onto the black sheet of paper, you're not going to scratch part of that off. So anywhere the line would be in that black area would show through because you can't erase on the black paper. So instead, weave in and out the way that you see it on the actual photo. So don't simplify, draw the shapes that you actually see. The other thing that you need to be careful with is you don't want to draw lines separating subtle value changes when it's next to a black shape. So if I was to draw a line kind of going around the darkest value that I see right here, well, that line is going to show because I'm going to take off a little bit of value for the fur that I see right here on the cat's face. But I'm not going to take off so much that it's going to hide that pencil line. So be conscious of, am I scratching enough in that area to hide the pencil or not? So I wouldn't even add a line around this dark shape. Your second option of transfer is to use a grid. So you can put a 1/2 inch grid on the small photo and then a 1 inch grid on your drawing paper. Or you can put a 1 inch grid on your reference photo and a 2 inch grid on your drawing paper. I prefer extra detail and accuracy, so I would choose a 1/2 inch grid here and a 1 inch grid there. Make sure when using a ruler that you're starting at the right location. So typically on a ruler, the inch mark doesn't necessarily start at the end of the ruler for some reason. And so look for the line where that 1 inch mark would start. Line it up across the top of your reference photo. And then every 1/2 inch, make a mark. Sometimes students will try to just guess and say, oh, that looks pretty vertical, and start drawing their lines right away based off of these initial marks. But then they're going to be twisted just enough to make it not look right. So you also want to make sure that you are putting 1/2 inch marks at the bottom of your reference photo. So again, line it up so the beginning of the inch mark starts at the end of the reference photo, and make your marks all the way down. When connecting these lines, you want to make sure that you have good pressure on the ruler so it doesn't slide around. And you want to double check and make sure that the mark at the top and the bottom are lined up. Some students will line the top up and then they go line the bottom up and then they draw, but they don't realize that the top mark is no longer aligned. So double check, make sure, is it lined up? Is that lined up? Yes. And then go ahead and draw your mark with your very sharp pencil. If it's too dull, you're going to have too thick of lines and it's going to start to hide all of the detail in your reference photo. You also want to make sure that you're putting 1/2 inch marks all the way down both sides. So after putting a 1/2 inch grid on your reference photo, you need to put a 1 inch grid on your drawing paper. Normally, when putting a grid on a drawing paper, you would make sure that you do it super light. But we are going to just transfer this drawing onto our scratchboard paper, so it's okay if this grid is dark. Now the issue is this paper is longer than a typical ruler. So when you come down here to put your marks at the bottom, don't go all the way to the bottom, just go down about this far, and then transfer your 1 inch marks. Then you'll line up your marks, draw your line, and since the ruler doesn't make it to the bottom, you just slide the ruler down. Make sure it's nice and even and extend the marks down. You can still do the measuring and plotting method even though you put a grid on there for the extra detailed areas. Like let's say that you weren't sure where this crossed on this grid line. You just put the tip of the paper on that mark, mark the edge of the grid, reline it up on that same grid line where you had it. So I had it against that line. And I go 1, 2, and then that dot is exactly right there. I don't have to worry about guessing. And same thing up here. I just want to know right where this crosses below this grid line. Tip of the paper on the dot, mark that little distance, and then reline it back up where it was and go 1, 2, and then I have 100% accuracy when drawing that portion of the eye. Same thing if I wanted to know where the top of this pupil is. I can put the tip of my paper on that dot, mark the edge of the box, reline it up in the same location, so the same grid line that this is on. Go that distance once, that distance twice. Make a line parallel to what I was measuring from, which is this, and then measure the opposite way. So tip of the paper on the dot, find my grid line, reline up my grid line, that distance once, that distance twice. Extend it parallel to what I measured from, which is a horizontal line. Wherever they cross, that is right where that part of the pupil goes. When you're using a grid, it's always a good idea to check negative space for accuracy. So if I was looking to see if I drew this part right, I would look at this shape right here, and then look back at the reference photo. Does that shape match? Does it not? If it doesn't, then you drew something wrong. I would also look at this shape, and then glance back at my reference photo and say, does that shape match? And I would do that for every square. Notice how I have smooth lines only around the eyes, the nose, and the whiskers. All of the other lines are zigzaggy around the different patches of fur. Also notice how I don't have a line continuing all the way around the eye in this area. And if we look at the reference photo, we notice how the black just flows from here right into the eye. Logically, we know there should be a line, but don't put one in black areas where lines don't visually exist from observation. If I was to put a line here and then transfer these to my black sheet of paper, I won't be scratching anything off in this area because it's purely black. So if I had drawn and transferred a line here, I won't be able to erase it once it's on that black paper. So don't put any lines in the black shapes where they are not visually existing inside of the reference photo. It's also a good idea to put some lines in the direction of the hairs that you see every so often, and this only will be in the light sides of the face. If you have any dark areas, don't put any of these marks. These directional lines will help you with the flow of marks that you're going to be making later on. In order to transfer your drawing onto the black scratchboard paper, you're going to need a number 2 pencil or an ebony pencil or a graphite stick. An ebony pencil would be better than a number 2 pencil because it gets darker and it's softer. So if you have one of these, use that. You're going to flip your drawing over, and then you're going to coat the entire back with this ebony pencil. You don't want to have any gaps, so you wouldn't want it to be like this because that won't transfer. So if I had marks on the other side and I try to transfer it, if there's nothing there, nothing's going to transfer. So give it a nice even coat across the entire surface. Now this is a good amount of graphite on the back of the paper. I don't have any real big holes of white showing through it. Everything looks pretty evenly coated. If for some reason your artwork is not transferring, then just add another layer of graphite, a thicker layer of graphite on the back. So now you're going to take your scratchboard, put it on the bottom, flip your drawing over so the black part of the scratchboard is facing up. Notice how the back of the scratchboard is white. And then you're going to put your drawing on top of it. And then you're going to take a couple pieces of tape and you're going to tape it on to prevent wiggling. So line it up nice and even. Once that's done, you're going to start tracing over all of your marks. So let me zoom in to show you how that looks. So now you're going to start transferring this onto your black sheet of paper. You don't want to trace too hard. You want to test out your pressure and just trace hard enough to get the marks to transfer. So I have kind of a light pressure. And I check, and yes, it did transfer. So I don't need to press any harder than that. So just go ahead and go all the way around all of your edges, tracing and checking as you go. Now it's time to practice. You should have a strip like this that's the excess cutoff of your scratchboard. On one portion of this strip, I want you to practice a realistic piece from your reference photo. So I'm going to draw the eye here. On the rest of this strip, you're going to try out different tools. So you can gather some from around the house, like this steel wool pad, and you can see what kind of marks does it make. Is that helpful at all to what you're trying to get from your reference photo? If it's not, then we don't need it. This kind of scouring pad gives you very little control over your mark making, and it kind of is taking it off in like a little bit of a rough way. So I'm probably not going to use this. They have finer steel wool pads that you might use for softer areas like the ground, but for me, this one did not work. I've heard you can use forks to get a certain mark. Never tried it. So yeah, it gives you kind of a larger scrape. So if you need something more bold, then I guess you can use a fork. I found this underneath my sink. Gonna just make some marks. Very hard to control. Ugh, and I don't like the sound of it. So probably not going to use this. Corn cob holders. Actually not too bad. Different corn cob holders, you might try all of yours out if you have any, because different ones might make better marks. So I might use this on my project. Not bad. If you have ones that are really dull, it might not work, but try it out and see. The other thing you can use is a paper clip. Take it apart. Get some tape. Tape it to a pen, pencil, marker, whatever you have. I would tape it so it's not too floppy. So don't have it way out here. Have it a little bit closer to the pencil itself so you have more control. This is a much larger paper clip, and here I have a smaller one, so I can try out those marks. See if there's any difference. So a very thin line compared to a thicker line, so I'm going to keep both of those. Also available to you when you're in class are scratch knives. And so what you do is you stick it into the top of one of these. And it holds it for you. So one of these is pointy and one of these is rounded. So the pointy one is going to give you a much smaller line that gets removed. And the round one will give you a little bit of a wider line. And then you can also scrape larger areas off. So if you have a whole white area, I can use the side of the scratch tool to scratch that off. So you're going to try out whatever tools you can find and figure out which ones look like the marks that you need to make inside of your reference photo. If it's not going well, don't use it. The main tools that you would use for distance learning are probably going to be these paper clips. So if it's not working for you, it's because you're not really using it in a good direction. So if I try to scrape this sideways, nothing really comes off. Maybe you need that for whatever reason in whatever spot, but I find that these work best when you pull it towards you. But you got to figure out what works well with your hand, what makes sense to you when you're using these tools. So try it every which way, get a good feel for it. So what I want you to also do before you start your project is try to ruin part of this scratch paper. How far can you push it before it starts getting messed up? So on the back side of this scratch board, you have just a sheet of paper. In between this sheet of paper and the black is a piece of plastic. So if you have too sharp of a tool, you can slice right through that plastic and start to rip it all the way through the white paper. So I want you to push kind of hard with your tools. How hard can you go before you start ripping that plastic? So I'm pushing pretty hard and the plastic isn't ripping. But again, if it's too sharp, it's going to rip it, and you don't want that. So it's pretty strong, but it has its limits. So try your different tools, see what it takes to actually go through and ruin that. This larger paper clip might be more successful. You really want to make sure that you know how far you can push your tools before you go too far. I also want you to take a piece of this and erase. I want you to see what it looks like when the eraser hits that black sheet of Scratchboard. It becomes glossy, and that's something that you can't ever get rid of. So you don't ever want to have to erase. I also want you to take your fingers, and I want you to make some fingerprints on there. I want you to see what that looks like so you remember not to do that. You always want to have separator paper underneath your actual drawing paper. And so it looks really gross and oily. Even if you wash your hands, you're going to have this problem. So once you've tried out all of your tools, you tried messing up the paper, you erased, and you tried out your oily hands on it, then I want you to try a realistic area. I've already drawn out my eye in pencil. So I'm going to try some of these techniques, pretending that this is my final drawing paper. I would never have my fingers on my final drawing paper like this though. So if we were using the classroom provided supplies, you can try out what does that look like and start taking off the marks in the direction that you see these hairs going. Making that transition that I see from black to white. Is that a big enough mark that I'm taking off? Do I need to use a bigger tool? So right now you're really learning what tools are going to work best for your project before you actually start your project. I'm really looking at the surface direction. How are these hairs curving? Notice how right here, I'm not pulling down, I'm kind of flicking it up because I want a nice ending to my hair. Not too blunt. I know I need to take off more here, but I'll go back and do that later. So sometimes it's a good idea to get a little bit on and then go back and take off another layer and another layer. You don't want to overdo it. You can't put this black stuff back on. Now I'm going to change my technique for the eye itself. I'm going to change from doing these parallel kinds of lines to pointillism. Once you feel confident with the marks that you're making, you can go ahead and get started on the project.